Here's my thesis for our time together today, that effective presentations require clarity of thought. And that's step number one. Let's clarify our thinking. That leads to focused content, and that leads to engaging delivery. And our ultimate goal when we present, whether we're presenting to internal or external stakeholders, is to gain some kind of buy-in and motivate some kind of action. There's something I want you to do, or there's something I want you to believe if you're in the room with me. And so the ways that we do that are we get to the point quickly and clearly, like I'm trying to do here. I'm telling you exactly what I want you to believe coming out of today. I want to increase engagement by moving us from just presenting information to helping our audience apply the information we're presenting. And then what we're really going to key in on today is including multiple pre-planned interactions to center our audience on the main goal. So a lot of the keeping the audience's focus we've talked about in previous calls. And before this session today, I sent out an email with a link to a call we held in the fall around storylining and a call that we held last month around executive presence. So we've already in this series talked about a couple of these things. Today, I'm really going to focus and hone in on how do you engage an audience, whether virtually or in person, to center them on the main goal. What are some of the presentation tactics that you use if your ultimate goal is to gain buy-in and motivate action? And here's how we're getting there today. The first thing that we're going to focus on is keeping the main thing the main thing. We'll then talk about what to do pre-meeting or pre-conversation, how to set yourself up for success before you ever walk into the room. We'll then talk about opening a conversation, and I'm really going to key this conversation on senior stakeholders. So how to open, we'll talk about managing the middle, and then we'll close with closing the conversation. So this is our roadmap for how we're going to achieve the things that we just talked about here over the next few minutes. And one of the reasons that this is so important to me and why I'm so passionate about this is just because throughout my career, I've often been the most junior, the youngest person in the room. And so when I've had to present, I have often had to dot my I's, cross my T's twice. Because when I walk in, I'm 15, 20, 30 years younger than the folks that I'm presenting to. I've got less experience, even though sometimes I've got more subject matter expertise. And so the way that I've had to make up for my age in those settings is by becoming a proficient presenter and by becoming a proficient storyteller. And I found that these two skills are the great equalizer. And if I can become a better storyteller, if I can become a better presenter, then I am able to increase the perception of my credibility and my actual credibility with different audiences and different stakeholder groups. And so just in my own background, coming from the political world, coming from the nonprofit world, being in the private sector for the last decade, I found in each of those settings that these are the two skills that have carried me through and helped me up some pretty steep learning curves. And so that's why I'm so passionate about this and why this is fun for me. And I'm hoping it'll be fun for you as we move throughout today as well. 4 things that matter when it comes to powerful presentations. I've referenced these already, but I wanted you to see these in order. Number 1, a great storyline. You can be a great presenter, but if you have a terrible story, it's like putting lipstick on a pig. So content matters, just like delivery matters. And again, I sent you all the link to that session in October. If you weren't with me, go back and watch it. We talked about how to develop a great story. Executive presence matters. We talked about that last month. Again, you've got the link there. Executive presence is carrying yourself like the peer of an executive and a senior stakeholder inside of a room. You're professional, you're cool, you're calm, you're confident, you're in control. And we talked ad nauseum about that last month. Today, we're talking about strong delivery. And then next month, we're going to talk about managing objections. And if you can put these 4 things together, then you are going to be well on your way to being an incredibly effective presenter. One of the questions I always ask myself before I walk into any room or any meeting is, why the heck am I here? So what? And so where I like to start almost every teaching or conversation that I have around presenting is by anchoring us all on this one question. This is the question that our stakeholders are asking, whether we're walking into a planning meeting, a review meeting, a pitch meeting, a client meeting. It doesn't really matter. Everybody's always asking, so what? I've got 12 meetings today. I'm incredibly busy. I've got a lot going on. All right, tell me why this matters to me and tell me soon before I switch off. So the North Star for me is I'm planning any type of interaction, even like this today, right? You all, showed up and you're probably thinking, and we're thinking, okay, like I'm here because it's good for me, because I'm going to get something out of this. And I had to hopefully make really, really clear up front what it was that you were going to get out of this and why it's important for you to stick around, because I can't make you stick around. And so the first thing that I have to do is answer this so what question. Here's why we're here today. It's because you're going to learn this. It's because I need you to do this. It's because here's the key takeaway of our time together, and here's how it matters to our organization, or here's how it matters to you. And we, again, talked in depth about how to do that in that storylining session. Today, what I want to do is break that down a little bit through the lens of how you present. So once you've answered the so what question, there's a couple other things that stakeholders really need from you and are looking from you inside of any meeting. Number one, I want to be fully and frequently engaged. And I'm going to talk to you on the next slide about 7 tactics you can use to keep senior people engaged. But I'm not interested in being lectured to inside of a meeting context like that. And I'm almost never going to let you speak uninterrupted for more than 3 minutes before I ask you a question or make a comment. So if you build in those engagement points, you're going to have a much smoother meeting and a much less choppy experience for everybody in the room. That's number one. Number two, senior stakeholders care a lot about being able to make decisions quickly. One of the things I've learned throughout my career is that there is often more debate that happens over what snacks go in the break room than around $100 million decisions that are being made by the C-suite. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point is that the higher value and the higher stakes the decisions are, the quicker they need to be made because of how high stakes they are. We can afford to go 20 rounds on the snacks in the break room because it doesn't really matter. And because people can wrap their minds around $20 decisions in a way they cannot wrap their minds and conceptualize $200 million decisions. And so what I care about as a senior stakeholder is having enough of the right metrics to make a decision quickly. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying I want to know everything. I'm saying I want sufficient metrics to make a decision as soon as possible. And so one of our goals is to tell a curated story, is to tell the right story that includes selective information and doesn't necessarily include everything. And then finally, what I'm really looking for inside of folks that present to me is trust that they know the next right thing to do. So what I want is to be able to make a decision. I want to be able to give feedback. I want to be able to adjust somebody's thinking or somebody's approach. But then I don't want to be involved after the meeting unless I'm a toxic micromanager. and so what I want is I want power to remain distributed inside of my organization, which means that I want the people who are coming to me who are closest to the data to retain ownership over execution and over smaller decision making. And what I need to be able to do that is I need the trust that you know the next right thing to do. And so one of your goals inside of all of these meetings is not just to get my buy-in and motivate my action around a specific recommendation or a specific belief, but it's to build your own credibility with every interaction. And the subliminal message you're sending me is, hey, I've got this. You can leave me the heck alone between now and our next touch point. And I'm hoping that I've proven to you that if I need your input, I'll proactively reach out and I'll get it. And so if you can give me that trust that you're going to do the next right thing, it makes it easier for me to make decisions. I'm able to make them faster, and I'm able to leave you alone, which, let's be real, is really what you want most of the time, especially those of you who are dealing with either difficult clients or internal stakeholders. So that's what I'm looking for from a stakeholder perspective. Now, how do you engage folks inside of a meeting? I've got 7 tactics, and here's the North Star that each of them point back to. That experience trumps all. So I mentioned a couple slides ago, your content matters, and it does. Like you can't come into me, be a world-class presenter, have a terrible story, and expect to get away with it. But what I remember isn't necessarily content. What I remember is the experience of being in the room with you. What I remember is the experience of being in the meeting and how you engaged me and how I engaged you and what the conversation was like and what the discussion was like. And so once I've got the story down, my focus shifts from just content to how do I provide stakeholders inside of a meeting an experience that's going to help them make a decision and that's going to reflect well on me. And so let's quickly walk through these 7 tactics, and then we'll apply them to pre-conversation, opening a conversation, being in the middle of a conversation, and closing a conversation inside of a meeting. So number 1, I tell people exactly when and how I want them to engage. So early on in our call today, I told you that you could pop stuff in the chat as we go. I told you that there was going to be a Q&A at the end. So one of the things that's really, really helpful for people is to upfront set the expectations for how you would like them to engage and welcome them into the conversation. Second, inside of a broader teaching or inside of a working meeting, I like to begin with early breakouts, especially when we've got more than 15 people in a room, making space, even if it's a minute or two, for people to break up into micro groups and have a conversation, have a discussion, reflect on something is a really great way to break people out of a rut and also to engage people who maybe draw back in larger group settings. And so beginning with early breakouts and then continuing them at regular intervals throughout a longer meeting or session, really, really powerful. Third, if we were in a meeting, if we were in a 2 or 3 hour steerco, one of the things that I would be doing inside of that presentation is adding at least 5 discussion prompts per hour. So you saw one that I added early on in our time today, which is what would you like to get out of today? Right? That does a couple things. Number 1, it breaks down the wall between audience and presenter, which is what I want. Number 2, it actually gives me really good feedback about what matters to you. Number 3, it conditions you to engage with me moving forward throughout the rest of our time together. And if this wasn't a fast-paced lecture, then I would have more discussion prompts. If this was a meeting where we were having to make a decision, I would have more discussion prompts built in to our hour together that at strategic points would engage you and either ask you a question, ask for your feedback, or get your reaction to what I had just shared. So if you're looking for an easy way to build these in, one of the things that we talked about in that storylining session is that effective stories usually have 3 chapters. And so if you add a discussion prompt at the beginning, some kind of engagement prompt after each chapter, and then a prompt at the end, you hit your 5. And so you can work those in pretty easily if you're going to follow the structure that we've laid out in prior calls. Number 4 ties into what I just mentioned, which is in each section, try to have at least 1 discussion, reflection, feedback prompt. So you can be sure that people are following the story and following the thread throughout your meeting. It's also going to give folks a chance to ask you questions, give you pushback even, which is fine. We'll talk about that. Share comments with you in a way that doesn't derail your presentation. Because if you've told me up front, here's how I'm going to ask you to engage, here's when I'm going to ask you to engage, it gives me some peace and relieves some of my anxiety around, am I going to be able to share my perspective or not? And if I know that when Kat's presenting or Eden is running a meeting, that she makes space for me to share that feedback, ask those questions, that it's going to be interactive, it's going to be engaging, then I'm less likely to interrupt. And I'm more likely to actually let you finish your train of thought. And chances are I might not have the same question at the end that I would have if I had interrupted you. 5th, this is one of my favorites. I like to make it as easy as possible, at least once in a meeting, for everybody to answer a question. So there's a couple ways that I do that. Number one, I use polls and I set a time limit and I tell people everybody's got to complete it within X number of seconds. Number two, if it's a smaller group, I'll actually, well, we'll have a conversation and I'll tell people that I want to hear from everybody before we move on. So just getting everybody involved, getting everybody's perspective, critical to making sure that you don't have folks, on TikTok or Instagram as you're moving throughout a session, and just to make sure that you're getting the feedback and the alignment that you need as you move throughout a particular meeting. Polls can also be really, really helpful to draw in quiet observers, folks who might never unmute themselves in a Zoom, or who maybe would be a little bit intimidated with speaking up inside of an in-person meeting. So those types of engagement tactics really, really helpful as well. And then finally, especially virtually, chat responses as well. We've got almost 100 people on this call. It'd be a little bit unwieldy for me to ask you to unmute and share. But chat allows us all to share feedback, ask questions, have comments, but do so in a way that doesn't derail the meeting. And so chat's another great way to drive that kind of engagement. And also allows people to verbally process as you're moving through something, because they can input things in the chat at any time. You have to be disciplined as a presenter to not be looking at the chat as you're presenting a slide. That's how you get sidetracked. That's how you get distracted. You want to be really strategic about opening the chat at certain times and addressing comments there if relevant. So now that we've talked about some of these tactics, let's talk about how we apply them in every stage of a meeting. So I'm going to start pre-conversation. I think this is actually the most important. Failing to plan is planning to fail. And so if you're not thinking about these things until minute one of a meeting, it's almost too late. So let's talk about what you do before a meeting to get ready. And my number one favorite tool is building an executive summary. And I've taken in a prior call a whole hour to break this down. So I'm not going to do that again, because I know there's a lot of you who are on that call as well. I'll just say this really, really briefly. An executive summary is my entire story on one slide. And I present that slide within the first 2 to 3 minutes of a meeting. It's my roadmap for the day. Hey, stakeholder group, here's what I'd like us to do coming out of today's meeting, and here's why. And this is the story I'm going to walk you through. Building that slide first and getting the story clear in my own head first helps drive clarity for me before, during, and after a meeting. And let's talk about before a meeting for a second. An initial draft of an executive summary is one of my favorite pre-read tools. So if I'm going to go to a group of senior stakeholders and I'm going to present some kind of recommendation or present some kind of update, I am rarely ever going to walk in blind, or I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to walk in blind. And the way that I do that is I set up a pre-read. And I can set up a pre-read with a few different types of people. I can set up a pre-read of my story with a stakeholder who's going to be inside the room who I have a good relationship with. I can ask them for 5 minutes on a call, and I can say, here's the high-level story. It's not all 15 slides. It's the whole story on one slide. Tell me, what do you think people's reaction is going to be to this in the room? Am I missing something that I need to address? Am I talking about something that everybody already agrees with and I don't need to address? That initial feedback from an advocate inside the room, critical to making sure you've got the right story and are thinking about your stakeholders in the right way. If you can't get to a stakeholder who's going to be in the room, I found that their gatekeepers are fantastic sources of intelligence. And there's not much that a box of chocolates or a gift card can't get you. Executive assistants, personal assistants, chiefs of staff, etc., right? Folks who are in the orbit of that person and who intimately know what that person cares about this month, this week, this quarter, what have you, and can give you insight into their thinking. You have colleagues who may have presented to that stakeholder group last week or last month. Can you leverage your colleagues? Can you leverage your peers? Can you take them the story, get their perspective on it, and say, hey, what did Susan really care about inside of your meeting with her? What was the pushback like? What were the questions like? Oh, you know what? She's really only concerned about solving this one problem right now. And if you don't address that or bring that up, then nothing else is going to resonate with her. Okay, great. Now, before I've gone and done a lot of work, I know what I need to include, and I know what one of my engagement points is going to be potentially. And so that pre-read, really, really valuable to get that initial feedback. Quickly, I use the executive summary at the beginning of my meeting as well to get initial feedback from folks on my story. So here's what we're here to do today. Here's what we're here to discuss. You're going to get questions or comments on that first slide that are going to help you adjust your focus on the fly and allocate meeting time on the fly based on the reaction that you get to that early slide. Really, really important. And then post-presentation, it's the one slide I always leave behind. So instead of leaving the entire deck behind, instead of leaving 20 slides behind that could be misconstrued, misinterpreted, whatever, it's one slide with the entire story. Here's a real simple example of an executive summary. And honestly, your executive summaries in some settings could be this simple. And so I'm not going to walk through this in detail. Again, we've already done that on a prior call. But you see, I've got a recommendation here, and I've got kind of 3 reasons why that's the right recommendation. And based on who's in the room, what kind of meeting it is, how good of a presenter I am, I could get away with an executive summary like this that's got 35 to 40 words. What I would do off slide is build a script like this and start to work on what's the off-slide context that I'm going to add to my on-slide content. And I actually do this for a lot of my slides, not just my executive summaries. So the speaker notes, a great way to do that inside of PowerPoint. If you're presenting virtually, having a whiteboard or Post-it notes behind your laptop, a great way to do that, to give yourself some cues and some reminders of the key message that you want to share from every single slide. In a way that doesn't make it seem like you're reading from a script. So for some of you, actually writing all of this out is going to be really, really valuable for you. And then you can make a decision after you've got everything out of your brain, what you put on a slide and what you say verbally. Pay attention to your transitions and pay attention to how you're going to end the presentation of each slide. Are you going to ask a question? Are you going to anchor somebody in the key takeaway? Or are you just going to have a transition statement that connects to the next slide? But building this kind of script, especially for those of you who have less presentation experience, can be really, really helpful to just keep you on track. One of the last things I do before I ever walk into a meeting is I map the potential objections that my stakeholders will have to my message. And we're going to unpack this in depth next month. But all I'll say at this point is that it's something you want to think about before you walk into the room. Why is this group of people not going to do or believe what I'm asking them to do or believe? And I actually write them down. This is just a generic example, but I write the objections down and I actually write down what some of my high-level responses are going to be to that objection or to that question. That does a couple things. Number one, it relieves my anxiety walking into a meeting. I feel prepared. I've already got a talk track in my mind or in my notes around how I'm going to answer certain questions. Number two, it actually helps me build a better story because as I think about the questions I'm going to get asked, I might change some of my content. Number three, it helps me figure out how I'm going to engage people, the types of questions I'm going to ask them. And number four, it actually helps me allocate responsibility inside of the meeting. So if I'm presenting in a group, let's say it's Eden and I, then we've identified ahead of time, okay, if we get one of these 4 questions, Eden, that answer is yours. Okay, if we get one of these 4 questions, Namaan, that answer is yours, right? Or if we get a question that deals with this category or this topic. And what happens then? There's less of the looking around the room awkwardly. There's less of the stuttering and the filler language while like your group figures out who's going to answer something, you've already pre-assigned who's going to address what. And it's just going to help your team, your group come across way smoother, more polished, more in control, more credible inside of the room. So using a slide, using a Google Doc to map these out ahead of time, I highly, highly recommend it. All right, now that we're prepared for being in the room, let's actually get there. Let's actually open the conversation. And so what I really want to talk to you about over the next couple of minutes are first your body language, and then second your diction. And really making a good opening first impression non-verbally inside of a room, inside of a meeting. So let's talk about virtual settings first. 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have even included this inside of our session, but the world has changed. And now probably we spend 80% of our meetings virtually, if not more. And so a lot of us have had to get used to, okay, what does it look like to present myself well on Zoom, on Teams, etc.? So you can see some of the guidance on this slide. Let me unpack it for you, though. The first thing that I want to communicate through my posture is that I'm comfortable. I'm not defensive. I'm not here looking for a fight. I'm not nervous. I'm comfortable because I belong here. And we had a conversation around kind of what it means to belong inside of a certain room last month during our executive presence session. So if you're interested in that, you can go back and listen to that. But some ways that I communicate that non-verbally when I'm sitting virtually. Number one, I make sure that my shoulders are square. I make sure that my face is forward and that it's in line with the camera, not the screen. So I'm not looking at my screen, I'm looking at my camera. Otherwise, it looks like this. Super awkward, not engaging, doesn't look like I know what I'm doing. It helps me to keep my feet firmly on the floor, facing forward. So I try not to lean back in my chair, even though I love doing that. I try not to like put my feet up on an ottoman when I'm presenting or put them on some kind of footrest. It helps me and it helps my posture to have my feet flat on the floor. That's what kind of conveys that solidity and helps me kind of fill the right amount of screen virtually. Third, I try really, really hard to keep my elbows off the table. And one of the ways that I do that is I actually move my chair back from my desk when I'm presenting. Because my natural, and I will break all the rules for you guys on this call, but my natural is to go like this or to go like this. And it's distracting, number one. Number two, it blocks my mouth. It can actually make it more difficult for people to hear me as well. So I try to keep my elbows off the table. It also messes up kind of my shirt, like it looks wrinkled. My shoulders aren't square and facing the screen anymore. It's just not as optimal of a look as keeping my elbows off the table. Along with that, it helps me to keep my hands a little bit calmer. And I am definitely someone who talks with my hands. I don't think that that is something that's necessarily negative. But for me, the way that I've solved for that virtually is I try to move my hands off camera. So I'm moving my hands right now as I'm talking. You can't tell. And every once in a while, intentionally or strategically, I might actually bring my hand inside the camera frame to reinforce a point or just to change the visual cue that I'm giving you. But generally speaking, I want to either keep calm hands, or if you're like me and you can't, keep them off screen, keep them off camera. And then finally, I like to try and keep my distance from camera. It's amazing to me. Like I interview a lot of people virtually. I talk to a lot of our clients virtually. It's amazing to me how many people, again, I'm going to break all the rules for you. They're on Zoom like this, right? Or they're like right up in my face inside of a virtual meeting or a virtual setting. And so I find that keeping my laptop a handful of inches from the edge of my desk and kind of filling the middle of the screen, but having like some buffer above me, having some buffer on my sides, right? Again, I'm using my hands for emphasis here, right? Helps just center me inside of the box without like me feeling like I'm right on top of you, or more accurately, you feeling like I'm right on top of you. One of the other things, I've already mentioned this, I find this really, really valuable when I'm presenting virtually, is having notes off slide. It's something you really can't do in person. So I try to take advantage of that when I'm presenting virtually. I have, even for this slide, I've got a couple of bullet points in my notes that just keep me on track. Some of you might use Post-it notes, on the side of your laptop. You might use a whiteboard above your desk. Lots of different tactics that you can use to keep yourself on track. I would highly, highly recommend, though, that even your scripts are high level. Bullet them, like make them phrases. Don't like write out 7 sentences that you want to like present on a particular slide. You're going to fall into the trap of reading sentences instead of being a dynamic presenter and just using those as guardrails and guidelines. Let's talk about in person. A lot of the same tactics apply. I'll just mention a couple of things here that are a little bit more nuanced. Number one, I find a lot when I've been in in-person meetings, especially when people are presenting to a group of us who are more senior than them, that their stance conveys that they're defensive or that they're walking in ready for some kind of confrontation. So keep an open stance, keep your arms to the side, not arms crossed, not hands in pockets, right? Face forward, hip square. Like I'm opening myself up to your feedback. I'm opening myself up to this conversation. I'm opening myself up to having a discussion with you as a peer. And so that subliminal messaging really helps set the tone for a meeting right at the beginning. This may sound self-explanatory, but please don't block the projector screen or the TV, wherever your slides are. You'll get feedback on that really, really quickly. So just be aware of kind of where all the projection is coming from in the room. One of the reasons you want to show up at least 15 minutes early if you can, if you're presenting in person. And then finally, memorizing your talking points for each slide, much more critical in person because you don't have the crutch of having off-slide notes. So if at all possible, you don't want to be reading something, you don't want index cards, you got to know your stuff. So if you know you're going to be in person, that extra legwork around what your talking points are critical. Let's quickly now talk through your diction. So before I even get to how you talk, I want to get to when you talk. And I think this is really, really valuable for the folks on this call who are a little bit more junior. If at all possible, you want to share within the first 3 minutes of a meeting. And when I'm on a call with folks on my team, one of the things I try to do is make sure that everyone gets a chance to talk early on. Right? How can you do that if someone's not making space for you to do that? Number one, you can suggest that everybody shares their introduction. You can do that early on in a meeting, or you can ask an early question. But nothing hurts your credibility more than if you are silent for the first 25 minutes of a meeting and then talk at the very end. No one knows who you are. No one knows where you're coming from. If at all possible, try and have your voice heard early on inside of a meeting. Second, bring some energy, bring some enthusiasm. If it doesn't sound like you believe what you're saying, nobody else is going to believe what you're saying. And there is definitely some fake it till you make it in this, right? It helps if you're genuinely excited. It helps if you're genuinely passionate. But one thing I found over the years is that if I fake it, the excitement actually comes. It gets my dopamine levels up. It gets my adrenaline up. And then it becomes easier to sustain that enthusiasm and that energy throughout a meeting. But if you're in front of the room, you've got to bring the energy. And that'll open people up to wanting to engage with you in a different way as well. You can speak at a natural pace. You can intonate. You don't have to have a monotone, monosyllabic way of communicating. If you're a fast talker, that's fine. Talking fast is a sign of intelligence. I would just caution you, just make sure that people are able to follow what you're saying and that you're enunciating enough to where people understand the words that you're communicating. So you can speak at a natural pace. If your natural pace is fast, that's fine. The other caution I'll give you here is just that if you get nervous and you know that when you get nervous, you talk faster and that's not your natural pace, then the only way to solve for that is practice. The more reps you get in, the better you'll do at maintaining that pace, maintaining that tone, no matter how nervous you are. Finally, I recommend that you leave a 2-second pause after each key statement. One of the things that I did early on in my career is the way that I would show that I was nervous is I would move from topic to topic to topic. I would try to get through my slides as quickly as possible, my story as quickly as possible, because if I didn't stop to think, then I didn't have to think about being nervous, or I didn't have to think about who was in the room. And so it takes practice to make a point and pause. Let it sink in without using filler language or filler terms. No ums, no uhs to fill the space. Let the key message sink in. Couple of other just best practices I've found through the years. Don't interrupt other people. Use humor at the beginning to build rapport, but when someone asks you a serious question, don't downplay their question or use sarcasm to deflect it. It just makes it look like you don't want to address the content of the question and that you're trying to deflect. So be careful as to when you use humor and sarcasm inside of a meeting. And then name people inside of the room as you go. And that's actually what we're going to talk about now as we move towards managing the middle of a conversation. How do you facilitate a conversation, whether virtually or in person, when it's not just you presenting and everybody else listening? And one of my first pieces of advice here is get to know the names of the people in the room. So whether that's you showing up early and having some small talk, whether that's you like bringing name tags with you, whether that's you asking people inside of a Zoom to rename themselves so their first name is apparent, call people out as you go to keep them engaged. I think I've mentioned Eden's name a couple of times as I've talked today. I think I mentioned Kat's name as we went today. I mentioned maybe somebody else's name. Kind of naming and renaming people as you go is a great way to keep them engaged. Second, you should absolutely know who the most important person in the room is. And at key points, when you have to make a decision, make space for that most important person. How do you do that? You can make eye contact with them. You can invite them into the conversation. But everybody is looking to that person in the room to kind of grant their blessing or to share their perspective before they're going to fall in line or before they're going to share their perspective. So knowing who the most important person is, who that key decision maker is, who everybody else looks to as their North Star is important. And then equally important is making space for them when you get to those discussion points, when you get to those decision points. I've often found the best thing that I can do at certain points inside of a meeting is just shut the heck up. Is make space, ask a question, direct something to people in the room, and let the discussion that they're having take over. And at strategic points, it's helpful for me to take a step back and let somebody else lead the charge. I also try really, really hard not just to call on people that I know agree with what I say. So I alternate calling on, I'll call them adversaries and advocates. But when I call on my advocates, I use eye contact and I smile to convey that insider status. Hey, we've had a conversation about this before. Hey, Austin, you remember when we had the sideline conversation last week and you mentioned this? Can you speak to what you told me last week? Bringing advocates into the conversation in a way that conveys that I've already got some people on my side inside of a room can be really, really powerful. And then smiling when I call on adversaries, I found to be equally as powerful. I'm not afraid of your questions. I'm not threatened by them. You've got valid points. We're both smart people. Let's have a conversation. But addressing those things head on conveys much more credibility. And then finally, I am a big proponent of cold calling. So when I'm in a meeting where we have to make decisions or we're having a discussion, because I've gotten to know people's names, I'll bring them into the conversation if I feel like their engagement is lagging or if I feel like they're the right person to contribute in the moment. And I'll call them out by name. I'll say, Amy, what do you think about that? And Amy might scramble for a minute, but she'll engage. And what everybody else will also know and take away from that is, oh man, Namaan might call on me at any time. Or, I might get asked a question or get asked for a perspective at any time. I need to be ready. Another way to keep the group engaged. I'll just say this really, really quickly. Don't cold call the most important person. If they're the most important person in the room, they're going to most likely share their perspective with you unprompted. They don't need the cold call. It's other people who need the cold call. What else do you do in the middle of a meeting? One of the things that I do, and I try to do very intentionally, is take notes. So especially virtually, I'll find a sneaky way to bring my pen into the frame so that people know when I'm looking away, I'm writing. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not browsing Instagram. I'm not doing anything else. I'm taking notes as other people are talking. So I'm very intentional about taking notes visibly so people feel like they're heard. We've already talked about learning people's names. I try to clarify every question that's asked. One of the mistakes I made early on in my career in all of these kind of high stakes meetings that I was in is I'd be like, I know the answer to that. Let me just jump right in and get going. Turns out I'm answering the wrong question. Right. And so I've learned over time that the best answer initially to any question is another question. Amy, what I heard you say is this. Right? Am I interpreting that correctly? Is that actually what you were asking me? First, it makes me look like less of a fool if I answer the wrong question. Second, it actually gives me time to think of what my answer is going to be. It's a delay tactic without actually being a delay tactic. And then third, by adding an engagement point every 3 slides or so, or every section or so, is another way that you communicate. I'm here to listen, not just to talk. And so if this was more of a group meeting where we were making a decision together or discussing things, that's the way that I'd be running this instead of it being more like a lecture or a teaching conversation. All right, let's wrap this up and get to the Q&A and have a conversation about what we've been talking about today. So how do you close a conversation? Let me just tell you this. Your last impression really does linger. So when I'm running a meeting, when I'm running a particular touch point, there are really 4 things that I try to do. Number 1, I try to recap the key takeaways. Here's what we aligned on. Here's what we talked about today. And here are the next steps that are the implications of those key takeaways. And there are 3 components to any complete next step. Number 1, what's going to happen? Number 2, who's going to own it? And number 3, when is the deadline that I'm proposing for that next step? If there's not a clear owner, if there's not a clear action, and if there's not a time-specific deadline, that's not a complete next step. So I want to align on those if possible before I walk out of the room. And then when that's done, I want to roll out. I've made a lot of mistakes and opened up a lot of conversations I didn't need to open up by sticking around in a meeting longer than I had to. Once you've got alignment on key takeaways, once you've got alignment on next steps, get the heck out of there. You got exactly what you needed. You got exactly what you wanted. Don't hang around for somebody to think of another point of objection, for someone to ask you another question, for someone to try and expand scope. Hallmark of executive presence is knowing when to leave. And so for me, when you've got alignment on these 3 things, it's time for me to head out. I'm going to leave a meeting. get what you need, and get the heck out of Dodge.